dois, experiência, um, dois, experiência.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Tá bom?
Ladies and gentlemen, the seminar will begin in a few moments. Please, if you don't mind, take your seats. Okay. On behalf of Her Excellency, the Portuguese Minister of National Defense, Helena Carreiras, welcome to the seminar, the international seminar, The War in Ukraine from the Gender Perspective. The seminar will be recorded and live streamed in YouTube, channel of the Ministry of National Defense. Her Excellency, the Portuguese Minister of National Defense, Helena Carreiras, will now open the seminar.
General Chief of the Army Staff? No, not yet. Vice Admiral, Head of the Military House of the Presidency of the Portuguese Republic, Ambassadors, representatives of the Portuguese Armed Forces, Chief of General Staff and Chiefs of Navy and Air Force Staff, Directors and representatives of the Ministry of Defense, General Officers, distinguished panelists and moderators of the International Seminar, ladies and gentlemen. More than 1 year after Russia's brutal invasion and war against Ukraine, we stand unwaveringly in support of the Ukrainian people and government and reaffirm our solidarity with the defense of their territory and population and of our shared democratic values. During this period, we have been inspired by the resilience of the Ukrainians, their leadership, and particularly the bravery of their armed forces in this fight for freedom that is also our freedom. Ukrainians are the key pillar of national resistance, which means that they are also the ones most affected. Men, women, children, and the elderly are being differently impacted for many reasons. Taking these differences into account is important to understand the dynamics of conflict, assess reconstruction efforts, and ensure that our position is grounded by a strong commitment to justice and equality. That is why including a gender perspective in our reflections might prove particularly useful. This seminar is a contribution from Portugal to this important discussion that I hope will inspire further action. I want, therefore, to thank the Equality Office of the Portuguese Ministry of National Defense for organizing this timely initiative, and the National Defense Institute for hosting it. Likewise, I want to thank all the speakers and moderators in today's event for sharing their views with this vast audience, both here in Lisbon, in Kiev, and virtually. The landscape of war and peace is not gender neutral, as the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325 recognized. Studies have shown a positive correlation between country rankings of global peace and gender equality. Further commitments from the international community to gender equality and to sustainable peace must therefore be inevitably linked. Indeed, strengthening gender equality and women's rights is both a human rights obligation and key for cultivating peace. As the 2015 global study on the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 demonstrated, the participation of women at all levels is key to the operational effectiveness, success, and sustainability of peace processes and peace-building efforts. We know that women have been central to efforts to countering Russian aggression since 2014, when Moscow illegally annexed Crimea and decided to back up separatists in the Donbas region. That has been very well documented by multiple international organizations and media outlets. When the conflict in eastern Ukraine began, women joined the front lines as volunteers, medical staff, and military personnel in the army and in volunteer battalions. As civil society organizations work to support internal displaced people, women activists and NGOs played a key role in providing humanitarian assistance. After more than 1 year since Russia's invasion, it is worth inquiring what additional lessons have been identified from a gender perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, since February 24, 2022, 1/3 of Ukrainians have been forced out of their homes. This is the largest human displacement crisis in the world today. Out of the 15 million forcibly displaced people, 90% are women and children. We see that also in Portugal, where among the almost 60,000 refugees welcomed so far, more than 35,000 are women. Nearly 14,000 temporary protection requests have also been granted to minors, accounting for 25% of the total number of Ukrainians in the country. There is also mounting evidence that conflict-related sexual violence is being used as a tactic of war. According to a survey conducted last April, 93% of Ukrainians know of such crimes committed by Russian forces, and 20% personally know someone who has been subjected to sexual violence committed by Russian troops. The international community is bound to investigate such crimes, and Portugal strongly supports these efforts. We have seen pictures of women and children fleeing as refugees, but there is less talk about the impact on them, leaving their husbands, fathers, children. Ukrainian men face increased vulnerability as they lack access to both financial resources and social networks. With women and children being prioritized in shelters, men's access is more limited. We see women voluntarily joining the army to save their own country and to protect their children, though for some, choosing whether to leave their kids behind to fight and defend their country is the real dilemma. In this dire scenario, Russia has been found to systematically use disinformation as a strategic tool to undermine social cohesion in European countries, using the war against Ukraine as a pretext. Sexually and gender-based narratives have featured highly in Russia's campaigns. We have seen examples of disinformation that build upon these preconceived ideas. In such stories, the implication is that if you are a member of NATO and have soldiers stationed on the ground close to the eastern flank, they bring violence and moral degradation. Ladies and gentlemen, differences in gender roles and stereotypes impact everything we do. This is why 23 years ago, the UN Security Council established the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. This global push broadly attempts to address the inequitable experiences of women in conflict and supports and promotes their role in peace processes, including negotiations. The discrepancies between how Russia and Western democracies have engaged with the broader Women, Peace and Security Agenda also highlight a real difference in the way we interact with our allies and partners. Gender is clearly one of the many possible frameworks for addressing the multiple impacts of this war, and we can support Ukraine in this context. Portugal is bound by these commitments, and we stand ready to even more bilaterally and to do even more bilaterally and together with our allies and partners in the European Union, in NATO, and other multilateral fora. That is why, following the many conversations I have held in the last months with Minister Reznikov, namely on February 24th in Kyiv, and based on the lessons identified by the Ukrainian armed forces, we began studying the possibility of developing military uniforms and clothing for women who are fighting in the front line and require suitable equipment. This comes on the heels of the donation of 5 armored ambulances that I announced last week in Ramstein in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and which elevates our combined military assistance to a total of more than 950 tons of material, in addition to the humanitarian support already provided thus far. Today, more than ever, we are faced with the challenge to meet words with actions and to place women at the hearts of our efforts to reach peace and security in Europe and elsewhere. As a Ukrainian female veteran said over women's motivation to join the fight, women have the same reasons as men for joining. We want to keep Ukraine free. Thank you very much, and I wish you all fruitful discussions.
We will now watch a video message from Her Excellency the Ukrainian Deputy Minister of Defense, Hanna Maliar, our keynote speaker.
Greetings to all participants of the workshop on behalf of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. I express sincere gratitude of the opportunity for the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine to participate in this event. 24th of February 2023 marked the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Therefore, greetings to all participants of the workshop on behalf of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. I express sincere gratitude of the opportunity for the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine to participate in this event. 24th of February 2023 marked the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Therefore, we can already analyze the experience of waging war, including the one concerning gender issues. Even before the full-scale invasions, we had equal opportunities for men and women, equal access to all positions for private, non-commissioned officers, and as well as military ranks and equal responsibility during military service. Nevertheless, the full-scale war presented us with new challenges, including gender issues. During the years of the war against Ukraine, since 2014, the number of female service members has increased by 2.5 times. Currently, the number of women of the armed force of Ukraine is 60,000, among them 43,000 are military. More than 5,000 female service members take part in the hostilities. Our women are mobilized and sent to the front line only by their consent. The war gave us an interesting experience regarding the problems of women. For instance, to combat conditions, the flaws of field uniform and body armor used by women became clear. Nowadays, new samples of field uniform for women are being tested. Women wear this uniform in the test mode. If these tests are successful, production of new women's field uniform will be launched. In addition to field uniform, we also continue work on providing our female defenders with body armor where anthropological features are taken into account. An experimental sample of body armor for women has already been developed. Currently, meetings with potential manufacturers are in process. The war has also shown vulnerable areas, in particular hygienes in the field. Another problem faced by both military and civilian women who have children. The war leaves no choice for women. If a man is a person liable for military service, then only a woman can take the child out of city or country. That is why our women are mobilized by their consent, so that families with children can take them out if they choose to do so. Thus, the war presents other perspectives on gender issues, and we take this new experience into account in our work.
We're sorry about some technical problems, and we'll now start the first panel of this seminar, the high-level plenary. And our guests are Irene Fellin, NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security; Burcu San, NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Operations; and Major General Nuno Lemos Pires, National Defense Policy Director. The panel will be moderated by Lieutenant Colonel Diana Moraes, Head of the Equality Office of the Portuguese Minister of Defense.
Madam Minister, distinguished guests, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, as we've heard, difference in gender roles and stereotypes impact everything we do, and our adversaries are capitalizing our own misconceptions and biases. Russia is strategically using gendered disinformation, as we've heard in Minister Carreira's opening remarks. Our military instrument of power needs to take this into account and integrate gender perspective if we want to maintain the advantage and continue to win our battles. Let me give you 3 practical examples of the importance of integrating gender perspective in what we do. Recruitment, first one, recruitment and retention. There is an important number that affects our ability to defend ourselves. At a time when threats are growing, we need to enhance our ability to recruit and retain the volunteers needed to fully staff our armed forces, and we cannot afford to exclude 50% of the population women. The second example, when we are talking about protection of critical infrastructure, building resilience and ensuring appropriate planning and preparation for response and recovery from attacks to critical infrastructure needs to integrate gender perspective, as the consequences of these attacks on women, men, boys and girls can be different, and so needs to be our response. And third and last example, neglecting differences in gender can lead to equipment that is not fit for purpose and therefore generate unnecessary risk. Body armors are often designed for a standard soldier based on a default male soldier. In the war against Ukraine, and as Deputy Minister Maliar clearly underlined in her keynote speech, women have highlighted numerous issues with the equipment fitting. Therefore, integrating gender perspective further into all our activities and tasks will give us a deeper understanding of the societies in which we operate, as well as the modus operandi used by our adversaries, giving us a greater insight into the gender-related aspects of war, whilst improving the ability to recognize and respond to our threats and challenges. Well, this can only be achieved with the engagement and commitment of the leadership, the decision makers. And today, we are lucky enough to have here an amazing lineup of speakers, which happen to be also decision makers. Therefore, with further ado, I will now present our first speaker, Ms. Irene Fellin, NATO Secretary General, Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security. Ms. Fellin, we are looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Thank you, Madam Minister, for the invitation and for convening us here. I think it's very timely and important. We talk often about this at NATO, as you know, but I think it's good to come together in different contexts to exchange ideas and lessons learned. I would like to especially address and welcome my friend Olena Suslova. And I think that I feel very humbled to be here today, and I can only learn from you and the other people, brave people from Ukraine. So I'm not here to teach. I'm just here to share some of the experiences that change the way in which we are now doing our business at NATO since the war started, and how our focus on the implementation of women, peace and security and human security have changed since the beginning of the war. We know that, I don't need to repeat that everything has changed since February 2024. We are looking at Ukraine, on the consequences of the Russia's war on the country and the horrific crimes that are committing against the population. The war is no longer a war between armed forces. Civilians have always been part of conflict in the past, but the feeling is that really here now they are the real target. Civilian population and the values that Ukrainian people represent. Crimes include willful killings, torture, inhuman treatment, forced deportation, and sexual violence, as is recognized now by all reports, and also the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry of Ukraine. And these horrific crimes attack and impact everyone and everything. Women, men, boys, girls, civilians and soldiers, but also infrastructure, cultural properties, livelihoods, and nature. And they will have a long-lasting impact on the whole Ukrainian society and also beyond. We know, as it was said, that this impact is not the same for the different individuals. And this is what was the driving factors when Resolution 1325 was adopted more than 2 decades ago. We also know that this resolution came from civil society, and this is why, for me, remaining in dialogue with civil society, even today in my role of NATO Secretary General Special Representative, remains extremely important, because this is where the needs come. But then security goes, it's a cross-cutting issue, and gender as well, so it's important that we understand how we in the defense sector and at NATO implement, understand and translate this agenda. So the resolution was landmarking, because we know that the first time the question of women's security, role and responsibilities within the security architecture was put at the core of the discussion of the Security Council. And these specific needs of women and children are also today driving my thinking and Allies thinking when we analyze and address the security environment and the challenges that we are facing. What is important to stress that we need to address the needs of and the role and responsibility of women in a peacetime if we want to be able to support women during a war. It's much more difficult to address inequalities when you are under shelling. This is an agenda about empowerment. This is an agenda that talks about the women's role within the society. And we all have this responsibility here today to start doing this at home. And then, of course, to support other countries, allies, and partners when they feel where they are under threats and then they are at war. But this is important to say that we cannot fix the problems that of a patriarchal society and an equal distribution of power, but I would say responsibilities in peacetime, in war, if we have not addressed this during peace times. This is why it's important that when we speak about UNSCR 1325 and the broader Women, Peace and Security agenda, we keep speaking about participation, empowerment, and women leadership in decision-making in all contexts. Let me now turn to what we do at NATO and what is my role today and how the Alliance has approached the agenda and its implementation in the past 15 years. As I said, we are all aware that this agenda was not born for the Alliance or for a military and defense context. But it is important for us. It is important for the defense system. And it's important that the way in which we make this agenda our own and adapt it to our core task and to our values. By recognizing the disproportionate impact that conflict has on women and girls, we recognize, as I said, the vital role that women play in peace and security, and that on one side, and the importance of integrating a gender perspective in all that we do on the other. The work on the implementation of women, peace and security is now supported across the entire enterprise of NATO by women, men, civilian and military, throughout all NATO structure. It's a given now. I mean, we are not putting this under discussion anymore. I had the privilege to be the advisor of the first special representative, Ambassador Maris Carra, back in 2013 and 14 during her mandate. And I have to say that was not a given at that time. The point was really still to explain to our colleague why we were doing this. People were coming and seeing the door, women, peace and security. So are you dealing with women's issues, women's problems? Now there is no discussion about this. Now the question is, how do we better implement what we are doing? So I see that in 10 years we have come a long way. And especially since we adopted our first policy in 2007, followed by the first action plan in 2010, where the focus was mainly about gender perspective in operations. This was, of course, the reflection of the global security context. We were heavily present in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, so this was the core business of NATO. Now things have changed and the security environment has changed, and this is why it's extremely important that the implementation of women, peace and security is across the core task, as it is stated in our new strategic concept adopted last year in Madrid. But more than that, when we negotiated the strategic concept last year, I was new at the office. I came at the end of January. The war started 1 month later. So all the work I was doing and all the work of the priority of the alliance changed. But I had something very clear in my mind, that we needed to embed the concept of women, peace and security and human security that are also falls under my responsibility at NATO within the strategic concept. The strategic concept is the document that gives the vision of the priorities and the work of the alliance for more than a decade, around a decade. And no strategic concept before this one had included a reference to women, peace and security and human security. So that was the momentum. The war was maybe again an eye-opener for us. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine demonstrates every day how strong the impact on civilian population, on women, the consequences of the conflict. So now we really managed to have this at the core of our vision. And this is really a milestone in NATO's implementation of the agenda. I want to quote the paragraph of the strategic concept and what it means for us. Pervasive instability results in violence against civilians, including conflict-related sexual violence, as well as attacks against cultural property and environmental damage. It contributes to forced displacement, fueling human trafficking and irregular migration. These trends pose serious transnational and humanitarian challenges. They undermine human and state security and have a disproportionate impact on women, children, and minority groups. And more than that, something that for us was very important is to make a reference of values. So the alliance also agreed to, and I quote, advance gender equality as a reflection of our values, end of the quote. And this is important because at a time when the alliance values are being challenged, this is a message of what is important to us. Applying a gender perspective is no longer something nice to do, is not an exercise, is not a tick in the box. This is a reflection of who we are. And now there is no more excuse because we all agree who we are and the values we represent. And we will fight to promote and support this value, and we will do the same in the context of our support to Ukraine. So the integration of the gender perspective now changed from more a tactical operational level to a political and strategic one. So we are all engaged in doing this, and now we are looking at how to translate these strategic commitments into practical and having impactful results. And we do this by integrating a gender perspective across the core task and across all the topic and what are the new challenges, emerging challenges confronting the alliance now and in the future. And the gender perspective helps us to better understand the human environment, not only the operational one. They are very much connected, but we need to understand the human environment in which we are going to operate and the distinct impact that this has on men and women. Around the world, we have seen that women play a key role in preserving communities faced by insecurity and conflict, and their economic and social responsibility increases in time of war. It was mentioned already the role that women can play and do play within communities, but at political level, and the way in which the role they play in peace negotiation and mediation when they have the opportunity to be part of the conversation and have a seat at the table. Women address the root causes of conflicts. It's a question of looking at negative peace or positive peace. We know that stopping violence and bombing, it's what we want. But then if we don't look and address the root causes, the peace that we will achieve is what we call a negative peace. It's the end of violence. But after a while, in short time, research showed that then conflicts will come back. So those are the opportunity to really address the root causes in order to build a more democratic and peaceful society. What is the impact concretely on the war in the work I do at NATO? It's still a learning process, as I said. it's easy. It was not easy to put this principle, but it was sometimes easier than to translate into practice and to change the way in which the machinery works. I would like to give 3 concrete examples. When the war started, we started within the House to have these regular updates and assessing on the situation of the war from different perspectives. And at the beginning, there was, as you can imagine, no gender analysis and gender updates. And then it came very clear that so we missed a gap, that we didn't have the full picture. And I started sitting at the table at the NAC and on a regular basis briefing the ambassadors, the Secretary General, and our colleague on what we call the gender analysis of the conflict, which is very much needed if we want to understand the impact of the war. We cannot cut off half of the population and ignore the impact that the war is having. But more than that, now also the intelligence is integrating this dimension, and the colleague coming with more reference to the political analysis, the operational analysis. So we are step by step, maybe slowly, but we are changing our way of doing our business. And I'm confident that with the time, there will not be longer need for me to sit at the table, because everybody will have changed the way of work. This is why this position exists. It's really to guide others, to show the way and to support a full integration of the gender perspective. The other way is that including women, peace and security, conflict-related sexual violence, and human security consideration in the training that allies are doing for the Ukrainian armed forces. As you know, that the different allies came together and supported the training of the Ukrainian armed forces in different countries, and those elements and those modules are included. And that this is also a positive element. And the other is that the work that I initiated to look in the way in which we can have a responsive initial support in the way NATO supports throughout the comprehensive assistance package Ukraine. And one of the things we were analyzing exactly what the minister said about the uniform and the need to adapt this to women's, but many more. And in the run-up to the summit, now the focus will be really on this and to see how this all the support that NATO is doing on non-lethal aid will be translated and make sure that is gender responsive. Something I always say also, using NATO as a political platform is as important to convey the message to all allies that when we, at individual level, at national level, you support Ukraine, especially in reconstruction and recovery, that the gender perspective is included now. Later it will be too late. And we know that this is the tendency, to fix things immediately and to bring the gender perspective later. So my suggestion is always the message that I convey is to do a gender budgeting from now. If this is not the time to reconstruct because we are not ready, this is fine, but the planning has to be done in the right way since now. I would like to conclude by using the word of the Secretary General that he expressed last week during his visit to Kiev. And here is stated that Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO. And over time, our support will help to make this possible. NATO stands with Ukraine today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes. Thank you for the opportunity to share my work with you today and to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the continuation of this interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you for pinpointing all the achievements and challenges NATO has achieved so far. You know, I'm a little less optimistic than you. We already discussed that, but we are not going to discuss that now.
It's my role to be
I know.
positive and optimistic.
No, but I'm glad that things are going well at the political level. So I will now hand the floor to our second speaker, Ms. Burcu San, I hope I spelled it right, NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Operations. Ma'am, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Minister, distinguished guests, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really humbled and honored to be here with you today. I share Irene's expression that we are here to learn, and I would really, I'm hopefully not going to talk very long, because the more important thing for me is to listen to you, to listen to your perspectives and try to incorporate them in my work. And just a word on my work, I'm Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Operations. And here, and relevant to the Russia's war in Ukraine, I have three main responsibilities as a division. So this is first to operationalize NATO's deterrence and defense. Second, support Ukraine with non-lethal assistance. And thirdly, also to, of course, take care of our current operations and missions, whether they be in Kosovo or in Iraq or maritime operations. So this is my file, and I'm also happy to say that we do take into account a lot of considerations, including gender perspectives, but I also want to acknowledge that we can do more, and commit myself to make sure that we do that. We know that Russia's war against Ukraine has shattered our peace and security in Europe. It has shaken the international order. Ukraine is defending itself under the UN Charter right to self-defense, and it has, of course, allies' unwavering support. And I'd also like to very much acknowledge the bravery of women and men in the Ukrainian armed forces and volunteers, and also the resilience of the Ukrainian people as a whole. This really inspires us, and we have a lot to learn from them. The NATO Secretary General visited Ukraine last week. He also visited Bucha, witnessed the evidence of horrific atrocities perpetrated against the Ukrainian people. We know, we acknowledge that these atrocities impact women, men, boys and girls in different ways. And Russian atrocities continue against the Ukrainian people today. As the Secretary General stated, those responsible must be held to account. The allies remain seized of this matter. As Irene said, in the North Atlantic Council, they discuss it based on intelligence briefings, based on Irene's briefings as well. And Ukraine's special envoy for humanitarian affairs, Mrs. Vasilenko, briefed the allies a couple of times as well. So they do remain seized of the matter. Since we agreed our first policy on women, peace and security in 2007, our policies and action plans have reflected an ever deeper understanding of how applying a gender perspective enhances our work, our situational awareness, and also strengthens our mission. From our original focus limited to operations, as Irene said, today we strive to integrate gender perspectives across all our core tasks. The guiding principles of integration, inclusiveness and integrity reflect our global WPS commitments, allies commitments and also NATO's commitments, but also the alliance's core values: individual liberty, democracy, human rights, rule of law, and of course our obligations under the UN Charter. I would like to give examples from two areas. One is operations, one on capabilities, so things that I do on a daily basis. So as you well know, since the early 1990s, NATO has been engaged in numerous operations and missions. Today in Kosovo, the connections that our mission KFOR has made with women's civil society organizations is essential to its work of maintaining a safe and secure environment. And in Iraq, our advisory and capacity building mission there is now the first NATO mission to integrate gender perspectives into every stage of the initiating, concept development, and the planning processes, and of course also execution. And WPS is one of the issues that our trainers and advisors there take up with their Iraqi counterparts. Then beyond operations, a few words on capabilities. Since 2013, gender perspectives considerations have been integrated in defense planning so that we can make sure that our capabilities are suited to all military personnel and do not put some of them at greater risk of serious injury. This matter has already been addressed by many of you, but I'd like to say that we also, in our material delivery to Ukraine, have taken account sizing. I'm very happy to hear that manufacturing of fitting equipment has taken place, and I'll take that back to my colleagues for their future work. Then we, of course, have still more work to do to standardize these approaches. And this is also the value of training and education related to WPS as well. Just turning to our practical support to Ukraine, of course, our practical support to Ukraine addresses the Ukraine as a nation. And the Alliance's goal here is to strengthen long-term practical support to Ukraine to ensure that it can prevail. So that's the short-term or shorter-term aim, and also in the longer-term deter future aggression. So we are clear that we need to break the cycle of toxic Russian aggression on Ukraine. This message was strongly emphasized at the Foreign Ministers meeting held earlier this month, and also by the NATO Secretary General at the Ramstein format meeting last week, just after he visited Kiev. Our principal support is delivered through the Comprehensive Assistance Package, or CAP, that Irene mentioned. This was enhanced at the Madrid summit last year. And this CAP assistance package for Ukraine and its encompassing trust fund provides us with a tool to demonstrate our commitment to Ukraine through concrete action. Inter alia, we are working to first continue to provide urgently needed non-lethal military assistance. Second, to develop a capability development plan for Ukraine's transition to modern NATO interoperable and sustainable weapon systems. Third, harness lessons learned from the war against Ukraine. Fourth, develop defense institution building and institutional resilience. And fifthly, explore ways to support the reconstruction of selected military infrastructure when conditions allow. Through this program, we stand ready to work alongside our Ukrainian partners to address Ukraine's short and long-term needs. To date, NATO allies and partners have donated about 390 million euros to funding this non-lethal support for the armed forces of Ukraine that NATO delivers. And we have delivered 80 million worth of material and equipment, including fuel, ration packs, medical kits, counter-drone systems. And we are working on other important items now, such as also bridges to cross waterways. This is complementary, of course, to the tens of billions of euros of bilateral military, economic, and humanitarian assistance which different allies and partners are providing. We feel that NATO's program of non-lethal military assistance fills a gap between lethal military assistance and humanitarian support. We are also now developing longer-term projects, including in the areas of psychological and medical rehabilitation, military career transition, demining, defense institution building, training and education. I believe this might be of particular interest to this community, so I'll give a few more details on these. As part of our military career transition program, NATO has a long history, in fact, of facilitating the reintegration of veterans into Ukrainian society, and this work will, of course, only grow in relevance as the war ends. We have also been financing psychological resilience seminars for commanders and deputy commanders of Ukraine's territorial defense force. This force currently exceeds 115,000 people from what we know, and the majority of them did not have military experience and appropriate psychological training before the war, and will be in dire need of psychological rehabilitation services upon their return to civilian life. So this project is demand-driven, based on requirements set out by Ukraine, and the specialized seminars are delivered by Ukrainian NGOs, who quite simply understand the local context and the needs of the combatants. On demining, we at NATO recognize the vast need that only increases day by day, and we are currently mapping and navigating the most efficient and strategically relevant way for NATO to support this area. And we, of course, for all these efforts, count on continued allied support, including from Portugal, both financially and in kind, as we develop these projects further. And in concluding, I would just say that Russia's war against Ukraine continues to inflict much human tragedy. Ukrainian society shows strength, resilience, and determination. We have much to learn from them, and we must continue to support them. As far as NATO is concerned, allies will continue to strengthen their short-term and long-term support to Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign country and deters future aggression. Understanding the complexity of conflict is important, and this is where Women, Peace and Security agenda and gender perspectives not only informs our work, but also helps us understand better what is happening on the ground, how this war is being waged, and which individuals it particularly impacts. And my last point is that NATO is a learning organization, and we will continue to learn and adapt our working practices in light of our experiences and in light of your experiences. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sen, for this comprehensive overview of what is the NATO's work, more in particular regarding operations, and you also complemented what Ms. Felin said. Thank you very much for that. And I will now give the floor to our third speaker, Major General Nuno Lemos-Pires, which is our National Defense Policy Director. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to be here today. And I wonder, can I really bring something new to this discussion after what we just heard? So I'll try to make a perspective in a different way. So I'm not a mathematician, so I don't do the math very well. So as you can see, the title of this presentation is 1 + 3 = 27. And my idea is to start talking about a little bit when we think about Ukraine and the determination of resolve. I think we can remember a little bit of what happened yesterday. Yesterday we had 49 years of our revolution, our Carnation Revolution in 1974, where just one day before that, women to travel abroad need authorization of their husbands, where women had no voice in politics, where a nurse had to choose between being a nurse or a wife, and this was just 49 years ago. So what a way we have come today to get to this level, and we have to think about what can we do in the future. So we have to talk about rights, responsibilities, same power, rights and democracy. I think the word democracy has to be put back again in this discussion that we are having. And then we're talking about empowering, talking about European and Euro-Atlantic values that we just heard in the beginning of this discussion. So the idea is, what can we say? In our country, we can say that Portugal is impartial. We use the legal instruments to be part of this action. And why do I call it 1 + 3? Because 1 means equality. And because it means equality, 1 is much more than just 1. That's why when it multiplies, it makes a huge difference. And we're talking about how can this affect and how can we be positive about what we can do with more equality between women and men. And the first reason I put these pictures here is because in any missions that we have, anytime we have more women in missions, we do it much better. And this is, right now, it's not like wishful thinking, it's just a recognized fact. And we can think this about missions in NATO, in EU, in UN, and I put specifically EUTM there because it has a triple effect. The second message I want to convey is, when we're looking at all of these missions, we're talking about communication. We're talking about a purpose. We're talking about to demonstrate what we can do by replicating a mirror effect. If we do it normally with men and women side by side, we can do it much better, and we can do it with a whole of government perspective and the whole of society perspective. Because in the end, it's about making society better. And society is only better when it is equal and it is democratic. And I want to use this word more than once. So let me talk a little bit about mathematics. So why do I use this formula? One is, of course, the multiplier. And the multiplier means the increase of number of women in missions and operations. If we increase the number, it's not easy to increase the numbers for many reasons. And of course, many of these reasons is because we have a lack of principles of equality, of gender-based equality in our society for the long, long term. But if we increase and if we get the conditions to do it, we can then apply it in 3 different areas. And we can have a spillover effect or a mirror effect in these 3. First of all, when women see women going outside and doing a fantastic job, and that's why I showed all of these pictures before. And you saw the pictures. When women see women doing the best they can do, we will have much more women coming to the armed forces. And this is a fantastic effect. I have been commanding women in many ways for a long time. Every time I have more women under my command, we do it much better. We can achieve much more goals because the second effect is the role, the effect of the role of women in the armed forces. Because one thing leads to the other, and people start to realize that we can really make the difference in many different ways. And third, it's a better perception of the role of women in societies where the missions take place, because this is the triple effect. So when we bring more women to missions, we will create an effect in our country. When we bring more women to missions, we create an effect of the perspective of the armed forces in general. And when we have more women in missions, in places, in high responsibility functions, then we demonstrate to the societies where we are, in any place in the world, from Afghanistan to Africa to other places, that societies, when they have equality in their work, they are doing things better. So what I want to do is, how could we reach the number 27? Well, we'll reach the number 27 when you think a little bit about how can we achieve a little bit of 3 outcomes. So 1 plus 3, you'll call me how I get to 27, then we have another 3. And the 3 is the 3 direct effects we have in national defense as a whole, in society in general, and international community. And just let me tell you a very short story. Lieutenant General Wahili Siddiq. Many of you that have been in Afghanistan maybe heard about her. She was a Minister of Public Health from 2001 to 2004. But she was a Lieutenant General. She was a fighting warrior. Because when the Taliban took the power after the Soviet invasion, she didn't flee. She said, I will stay with my people, I will serve my country. And in the beginning, the Taliban sent her home. She said, they told her, you are a woman, you cannot work. And she said, okay. But after 2 years, and after a lot of fighting, they went home, to her home, and asked, can you come back and help us doing some job in the hospital? And she started, and she put her uniform. At that time, she was a lieutenant colonel. And she started to make all the difference in front of the Taliban. And she always said, I cannot flee because I was serving my country. And because of her example, in 2009, I heard a teacher in Kabul telling me, we always remember this Lieutenant General because of her, we believe that women can take power. She died 2020, before the Taliban took power in 2021. She didn't see it. She died for COVID. She didn't saw what happened. But we can see that her example maybe will have a little bit of hope for the future in Afghanistan. So the idea I want to sell with this first story is we can really look at this as a multiplier and then reach the number 27. We can look at the national defense as a whole, and we can see that if we have more women in missions, if we have more women representation, we have more women in high positions in the society, we can have more recruitment, we can get more attention, we can have more adaptability, we can have more connection with the civil society, we can have better enhancement for the culture and the literacy of defense, we can have parity, and we can have conciliation. Conciliation is not about women having the characteristics or the tools to work better. No, it's about men and women. It's about empowering both, I'm now quoting my Minister of Defense, it's about empowering men in their own homes so they can be better husbands, better wives, and divide everything. If we empower everything, we'll have better people going to the missions, because many people don't want to go to missions because in the end they are worried about their kids. And it's natural. And this is not a problem of women, it's about a problem of all of us. I'm a father, I have the same problems as my wife. We should treat this equally. This should be not a difference. The second thing is, of course, society. And society is about recognition, justice, responsibility, credibility. Let me talk a little bit about credibility with story number 2. In 2005, now Navy Captain Filipe Albergaria, at that time she was a lieutenant from the Navy, she was in Pakistan aiding the people from earthquake NATO mission that we had there. And during this NATO mission, because the women arrived there, they were able to treat women and children because men were not allowed to treat women in the hospital. And this gave hope to local populations, and some of the women came to her and said, we never saw a woman in power with ranks. And second story from the same person, Navy Captain Filipe Albergaria, now in Mozambique 2022. She started a program what we called First Aid Psychological Treatment. And she was there alone at night in Dongo, talking with more than 50 soldiers from the Mozambican army. And she told them, tell your stories about stress in war, in Cabo Delgado. At the beginning, they didn't want to talk. She was alone with them, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then started talking one by one, 2 by 2, and then everyone wanted to tell the stories. Terrible stories about violence, decapitation, and everything. And in the end, one of the guys said, if you were a man and not a woman, maybe we haven't talked so much because you look like our mama. And this gives an idea about different things how we can reach there. Third thing is about prestige, values, and international community, because people, it's a mirror effect. When they see women in uniform going to Central African Republic, in Mali, in Somalia, Afghanistan, as I just said, you can see values and principles in work. You can see the demonstration. You can see example. You can see intervention. You can see multidimensional. You can see humanitarian assistance, conflict prevention and resolution. And it is all about exemplarity. And let me give you the third story that I wanted to tell you today. The second lieutenant, Claudia Moisés Pinga. She's a Marine from the Mozambican Armed Forces. She got the badge. She was able to conclude the course of the Mozambican Marines that are delivered there by the Portuguese Fuzileiros. And she's a very proud woman. And she is one of the best trainers that we have in Catembe. And then she went with her platoon, with a quick reaction force trained by the European Union Training Mission. She went to Cabo Delgado and she said, we learned different things. And the first day on the job, she led by example, going inside the village and taking the pilão, to work side by side with the women in that village to just work with the food. And she did that for 3 days, 4 days. She never left the women there. And so everybody wondering, what is this girl doing here? She should not be wearing uniform because they were not used to see women in uniform in a fighting force like Fuzileiros. And they were wondering what she was doing. And she said, well, we are preparing your future. We are preparing the future of this village. I'm a lieutenant, but I'm also a woman, and we need to work together to fight the terrorism. And this spillover effect was so big that even the national TV in Mozambique took her example and put her out in the news. And this is just the third story I wanted to tell you about. So, last essential, this is what we said after the revolution in 1974. In 1976, we wrote the Constitution, and it is so simple to apply it because it's all about democracy. We should not have this discussion about equality. We should not have this discussion about these things, but we must do because we are not there yet. And that's why this formula makes sense, because one is much more than one. When you're talking about equality, it's an expansion. Well. Last but not the least, I just want to finish with this idea that I brought here. Does it make sense that in 2023, and we're talking about this, in this effect? And I would say yes, because with the war going on in Ukraine, and we're talking about gender perspective and what we are hearing, the thing is, should we still have this discussion? Of course not. It makes no sense. But we must have this discussion because it is the way for the future to bring democracy, resilience, rule of law, international-based rules, order of international law, it's all about equality, believing on people and empowering people, empowering children to have the right to subside. And last, why I just brought these 3 sentences there, because in the end, and I will end with this story, in Mozambique also we had a lieutenant from Estonia called Kadri. She was a second lieutenant. She was 30 years old. And the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, she had a speech because it was Estonian National Day. And she had a very famous speech there. And I tried to remember what she said because I didn't write it down. But she said more or less like this. This is the day that the war started. And me, as a woman in uniform, I'm a proud woman, but that represents citizenship. We represent the rule of law. We represent gender equality from the Baltic Sea to the Mozambican Channel. I think it's a very proud sentence to end. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for this very interesting and innovative approach to talk about women, peace and security and gender equality. I'm an engineer, so for me it was fantastic. Thank you for that. So we will now have some time for questions from the audience. But before I give the floor to the audience, I think I will use the privilege of being moderator and start with the first question. So all the 3 speakers talked about core values. Our values, General Lem-Spears talked about democracy, and we all know that this war against Ukraine, at the end of the day, it's an attack to our values. And it's interesting that also all of you mentioned that it is a given or there is no need for discussion. And it is true that the United Nations Security Council resolution more than 2 decades ago recognized officially the need to promote women's participation. Research has proven that. We have had here several examples from the ground about the importance of integrating gender perspective and the importance of women's role. But what we know is that in NATO, only the average women percentage of women in the Allies armed forces is 12%, and this is 2019 data, which is the last data available. It was interesting for me to hear the Deputy Minister of Defense from Ukraine telling that since 2014, the number of women in their armed forces increased 2.5 times. Because I was just wondering, and this happened in the past, do we need a war to really increase women in our armed forces? And sir, you were saying your experience that you are a father, you and your spouse have the same concerns, the same problems regarding your children. But interestingly, when in last September we launched our Defense Action Plan for Equality, we asked militaries that are deployed in Mozambique to send us a video where we made some questions regarding work-life balance. And one of the questions was, what did your friends and family told you when you told them, you notified them, you were going deployed to Mozambique? And we will ask this both to men and to women. And we just recorded the video. And what was the result? All the women said, oh, my family told me, how are you crazy? How are you going to leave your children? You cannot do that. All the men said, my friends and my family supported me. So this is empiric information that was collected just because we asked the question and they sincerely responded. So my question to you is, we know it's a given, we know it's more than proven that we need to increase women's participation, but what can we do more, like Ms. and we can do more. what can we do more, and that I'll leave it to you. Maybe we'll start with Ms. Feline.
Thank you, Diana. I will be very frank. In the past week, I have been thinking about this a lot, and I didn't find an answer, but another question. And the point for me, and maybe it's you are best positioned to answer. Do women really want to be part of the armed forces? Because I was looking at the numbers. I was in Iraq last month, and a lot about the mission that Burcu mentioned, that this mission is particularly relevant for NATO, because for the first time, the integration of WPS, human security, and gender equality are part of the objective of the mission itself. So it's not an add-on. We didn't learn that we needed to have a gender advisor while we were on the field, like in Afghanistan. The nature of the mission is completely different. We are there to advise. And we found it essential to advise on those topics as well. But the numbers are very low. And when we talk with women there, I met very high-level of women in the highest level, Director General in the MOD, but they are very few. And when we talk about the challenges women have, what they also share that in the end, women don't want to change the status quo. They are not so attracted by the contest. I take Iraq as an example because I was there, but then I brought my reflection back, looking exactly at the number you shared. Because when we look at Ukraine and we see the 30%, we know, the minister also mentioned, they are not only in the front line active, so there are different roles played. We have to be careful with that. But still, it took 20 years for NATO allies to increase from 6% to 12. 20 years. So that's the right question. It's, do we need the war to increase the number? So my question is this what women want? So where is the problem? The problem is in recruitment or in retention? Is the problem that once you are in, you see the challenges, the barriers, because of these inequalities, because this lack of conciliation, and then women leave because at the end of the day, the responsibility of children is still perceived as our own responsibility, or it's because there is less attractive, and more is less attractive because there are not enough women. So what it is seen, and the model represented is pushes women back because they don't recognize themselves. So I think it's a little bit that. I see this with my own girls. When they are 8 years old and we look at role modeling and seeing what is, they need to identify themselves. One of my girls is more attracted by activities, it's a different size, so it's more sporty, and she thinks she has to be a boy to do that. So my effort is really to tell her she can be a girl and do whatever she wants, but not seeing the models brings her to identify herself in the need to be a boy, because otherwise she doesn't feel that she can be empowered to play football or wear trousers instead of a skirt. But still, I would like to initiate, and that's why I say you maybe know better, is this attractive for women? Is this what women want? Or are we forcing women to do something they don't want, so we are reproducing some toxic dynamic?
Do you want me to answer? Well, that's a very good point. Are the armed forces attractive for women? So I think it's, and this is my personal opinion, there needs to be a balance. Of course, we cannot push women to join the armed forces, but the armed forces need to ensure they are doing all their best to make the organization attractive for women. So that's what needs to happen. If there is still some informal barriers for women to serve in the armed forces, and you mentioned very well, the same in Ukraine, the same in NATO and in the allies, from the 12%, not all women are in the operational part. So we have to make sure they can be whatever they want in the society, in the armed forces, and then it's their choice. But also the role models is very important. We need to show young women that they can become generals, they can be deployed, they can lead an operation. So, because otherwise it will be very difficult. If they only see men doing their job, they will for sure think this is a man's job. I will stop here because I'm just a moderator, and I will hand it over to Ms. Sen, please.
Yeah, thank you. It's, I think, a very important, interesting question, and we also ask ourselves similar questions about other walks of life where girls are not encouraged to join, and they're still in their studies, they're more expected to pursue humanities, whereas boys are more expected to pursue sciences, maths. So it's an overall problem, and I think role models is one aspect. Making the armed forces more welcoming is another, and in fact, Mr. Amalia touched upon this, and she mentioned, of course, the uniforms, the body armor, hygiene, important when you're deployed. It is easier for men to negotiate those hygiene issues, so take care of that. And also, she mentioned, and that's what I think critically important for the society or social aspects, is the children. And as Irena mentioned, I think it is still seen by the society that the children are more of the responsibility of the mother than the father. I have a daughter and a son, and I would say my daughter is much more, in fact, by nature suited to pursuing a career in armed forces, I would say. She's much more disciplined and serious, and my boy is only there for the fun. And I think my daughter would be excellent leader, in fact, in any place, but including in the armed forces. I talked about this with her a little bit. We have the Defense Academy of Belgium very close to where we live, and we see some of the cadets. Most of them are men, but then the heir to the throne, Princess Elizabeth, was doing her training, military training, and I think she will have a rank in the armed forces, like of course her father does, the king. And this was an interesting role model. I showed that to her, and I think that was also when she said, "Oh yeah, this looks really something important and something that a tough woman like Elizabeth can do." And so I think it rang a bell. So yes, role models and making the armed forces more welcome, and also trying to change as much as we can. Of course, affected the societal expectations from girls versus boys, but also leaving. We cannot force, of course. It has to come from within. It has to be a voluntary choice.
Just 3 ideas. I work today in an organization called the DPD, Defense General Directorate, where we are 50-50. It's not an issue. And we do benefit because we are 50-50. So we don't think about it, we don't talk about it. We have a high women position. My deputy she's there. Is a she or a he, it makes no difference. And I think in the armed forces in the future we will get to this. And we will get to this naturally without, it's about equality of opportunities. It's not about forced parity. We cannot force people to do or to be whatever they don't want to be. So in the end, it's not about replicating every area with everybody 50-50, because that doesn't happen in real life. So there are certain job opportunities that the men are more prone to go to, and some of them women will go more to. But in the beginning, it has to be equal opportunity for all of them. And we know that we are better armed forces if we have more parity. And that happens in our life. And one of the issues is, of course, and answering your question about why it happened in Mozambique, and I had this concern with all the people I had there, because I wanted to bring a lot of women to the mission, and I had these answers from many of the women I tried to bring to the mission is conciliation. And I think that the efforts that we are doing now, the armed forces, the services, what they are doing, the national defense, it's all about conciliation. But it's not conciliation between women and family. It's about military in the family. It's about having opportunities to reach back to the family reaching back, taking the family with them when you can, and having more time when you move places. It's all about conciliation, and we have to do that, and we have to be very practical on that. Because in the end, what we want to do is create parity opportunities, but we'll never jeopardize the end state. And the end state is to have a very efficient organization. And when you talk about the quick reaction forces in Central African Republic, what is the first thing people talk about? Is they are really effective. In the end, it doesn't mean if they are very human, but you have to be effective. So the effectiveness is a must, but the process is very important. And we have to watch the process and make conciliation a better effort. So that would be my opportunity.
Thank you very much, the three of us. I will now hand it over to the audience. Here, please. We have mics.
Thank you. Catherine Wright from Newcastle University. I appreciate the panel acknowledging that women, peace and security is not just about women as victims, but also women as agents, and that a gender perspective is about looking at the impact on both men and women. It's also about acknowledging that women's voices often aren't heard because the reality is that men continue to dominate decision-making positions. So I wondered if the panel could elaborate more on what mechanisms are in place to hear from Ukrainian women and to consult with them, and to ensure that this informs the support that is given for Ukraine, and that this is therefore the right support for the whole of the Ukrainian population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Very interesting question. Ms. Feline, please, we'll start with you.
Yeah, for me, that's a participation in decision-making processes, and women as agents of change remains the key pillar of the resolution. And this is a challenge I have when I said I addressed the NAC and I made my updates. It's frequently that the conversation turns into looking at women as victims and what's happening at the population. So I always conclude my intervention by reiterating the importance of the participation. So what I have done is consulting with women at different levels, from government, parliament, in different formats during the past year. At the end, they were also the ones who were allowed to travel outside the country, so the gender impact it was very strong. Women, due to the martial law, had to stay. What was my perception, and I don't know if I was wrong, is that there was not enough attention on that fact that women were negotiating. They were negotiating within allied countries for ammunition, so the arms, and then in all the government. So it happened that I met several times with them in Brussels, but also during other conferences in coordination with the OC, for example. But when it comes to my responsibilities, I'm now try to relaunch the body. We had the Civil Society Advisory Panel. We talk about this with you, Catherine. So this is, and Olena was a member, and I hope she will be again a member in the new reiteration. As part of an action plan, a NATO action plan, Women, Peace and Security, Allied agreed to formalize a body of civil society representative to maintain this contact I was mentioning at the beginning of my intervention with the one holding, at the end, the core of the agenda. Unfortunately, during the past mandate, before I came to NATO, due to COVID and lack of funding, it was very difficult to maintain this body effective. So now that the conditions have changed, I hope, so COVID is over, we have also some funding. I hope to be able to make the best use of this, and certainly Ukraine and the region, and the possibility to create a platform to women to be heard will be used as part of this body. I think your question is very important because it is difficult to keep the focus on that. You know me, and you know that this is my priority, but then when you have a role in a different context, then the attention goes somewhere. So the effort I make is to really bring this back, but then that's already a big effort. Then being able to implement, to do this requires an extra effort, and I think that we all need to do this more. What I found strange, a little bit what I said, is maybe it's my perception, I would like to hear from the others, that there is less talk about women in power in Ukraine. There are many. I mean, many of the deputy ministers are in charge. We had the general prosecutor at a certain point. But then in the conversation and in the images, this comes less often than women portrayed as holding the power.
Thank you. We are in some ways lucky because we have a interlocutor in Ukraine, the Deputy Prime Minister Stefanishina, and she's in charge of relations with NATO, and we deal with her a lot in our capacity building programs. But also we have an entire program for reaching out and hearing from the civil society. And especially, I mean, on all the programs, but we would also, I think, very much partner with them in the psychological and medical rehabilitation project that I mentioned. We have a number of colleagues, Ukrainian colleagues, who work for or with NATO and the NATO representation to Ukraine. They actually just visited our offices last week. And in fact, there was only one man among them. There was like 10 and 10 women. So they are very active. Not that because just they are women, but I believe we can build on their access, their understanding, their appreciation of what is helpful to the society as a whole. And we were not, I mean, certainly not only directing our efforts towards men. I have to say that the Ukrainian defense planners are more a boys' crowd. We work with them a lot on this long-term defense capacity program. But we also have a long history, of course, in Ukraine for about training and learning mutually on gender perspectives, women, peace and security, because it's always been part of our approach to Ukraine and our programs in Ukraine, but certainly something to build on in the future.
Let me talk a little bit about pragmatism versus idealism. Pragmatically, when the war started in Ukraine, the order was given in the country for the men to stay in the armed forces, then women can leave. And that's pragmatic approach. Should it not be like this? Probably it has to be like this because society is still organized like this. And so men had to stay, and we just heard the numbers, 90% of displaced are women and children. And that makes a divide. But does it make a divide on equal opportunities or in the opportunity for people to voice their own concerns? That is where we should work in. So a pragmatic approach is society, it is what it is, but then we have to make sure that we hear everyone and that we give opportunity of being in different places. And we heard the word consent 3 times from the Deputy Minister. So women to go to the front line, they have to consent. So that's a different option as well. We're talking about divide there. But as long as you have equal opportunities and you can do the job, then in the end, it can have the mirror effect. It can change society. But the pragmatism that we have to have in this approach is step by step. We cannot change the world just like this.
Thank you. We have there another question.
Good morning. I would like to thank this wonderful opportunity to discuss the war in Ukraine from a gender perspective. My name is Monika Riersch. I'm from the Institute for Political Studies. And my question is regarding also this special situation in the Ukraine at the moment, because in many of the presentations that were really very interesting, gender issues were presented a little bit as being the same. And of course they are deep down, but it's very different to be a woman in Afghanistan or in Libya or in Ukraine. So I think that the agenda has to be very specific and look very specific at the culture, at the region. And of course, a woman in Ukraine has a lot more to do with a woman in Western Europe regarding her literacy, regarding the jobs she has, the cultural freedom she has, etc. So my question is, what is at this moment the greatest danger for women in the Ukraine, in the war? I presume that as many men are on the front line in the battlefields, they will stay at home. They have many other challenges. So this is my first question. What is the greatest danger for women specifically at the moment in Ukraine? Secondly, how can we help concretely? How can NATO concretely help these women? And thirdly, do you think, and I understood that you're very positive about it, and I hope it is so, will women really be on the negotiation table once this war one day is over? And so will women really be empowered? Their institutional structures, they are very strong in the Ukraine, many women in parliament, so I'm very hopeful. Nevertheless, war changes many things, so these would be my questions. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you to repeat the third before the negotiation?
The first.
The third.
The third. When Ukraine wins the war, will women really be involved in the negotiation process and in politics again? I believe so, but I would like to hear your very critical also opinion, because this is exactly the weak point of many action plans. They are very nice theoretically, and then when the negotiation starts, women have so much to do with rebuilding, with healing, etc., that they are just not participating in politics and in the negotiation process on the high table. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know if we can guess the future, but we will try to be positive, and let's hear Irene, her thoughts on this, please.
Thank you. On the first one, what we all agree that when we cannot put all women together with us, in different countries, not even in the same conflict or country, you can say that one woman does represent the others, because you differentiate by age, ethnicity, coming from the capital of the rural areas. So we always say when we look at the composition of an ideal negotiation table, we should put intersectionality as part of the way in which women and men are sitting on the table in order to represent their own constituencies or population. The way in which we apply the gender perspective, the mechanism, this is the same. As NATO, as an alliance, is the integrating this vision. Is like putting the gender glasses, so the way in which we ask ourselves the right question and then develop the answers. In order to do that, we need to listen from the population. It's not, Ukrainian women are not Afghan women. In the same way, women in Sudan are not the same, such as Libya, because of the culture, because of the causes of the conflict. So we all agree on that. But the tools, when I speak from my side, the tools are the same, the way in which I adapt the tools of NATO in order to be able to respond to a conflict or our possible intervention in an Article 5 situation. In terms of increased risk, this is something that we certainly know is economic insecurity, is emotional insecurity, and something it's very much connected with rising of domestic violence. Unfortunately, we know that it is a problem where women are affected by domestic violence. Out of 3 women all around the world experience this once in life, and we know how much this is connected with conflict, and when men come back from the field and the front line, this is a phenomenon, and I'm sure that Olena will talk more about this. This is not only in Ukraine, but certainly we know that this is something that it's happening right now. On negotiation table and peace, no, I'm not optimistic. I try to play this role, but this was the job I was doing before joining NATO. And the point is not that because women are busy with doing other things. The problem is that women are excluded from power. And exactly because we as a women deal with different issues within the community, that we should sit at the table because we know what we need and what the population, the families and the community needs. But this goes back to what I said before. You cannot fix a system during conflict and in post-conflict if the imbalance and repartition of responsibility was not equal before. So it's about equality. And I really like your last slide when you said if there is equality, you don't need quotas. The point that we do need quotas because there is inequality, and we need this as a temporary measure. I'm not in favor in principle, but if there is no other way, we need to bring back to equality, have the equal opportunity, dismantle the quota system, and be able to share our concern and our responsibilities.
Thank you. I think the greatest danger, I think that's covered by Irene and will probably be talked about more in the next panel. Also the last question, will women be on negotiation table? I think it's a question for the Ukrainians first and foremost. Of course, we should encourage that, but it's up to them in the end how they will form their negotiation team. I would say from what I've seen that I'm a bit more optimistic that women be part of it, also because they're playing such an important role in the conflict at the moment. I think it would be very odd if they were not taken into account part of the negotiations. But how do we help concretely? I think first and foremost we help Ukraine prevail because that's for the Ukrainian society as a whole. And as I think the minister mentioned at the beginning, it's the same reason why women join the armed forces today of Ukraine as men, as their man colleagues. They want freedom for Ukraine, they want to prevail. So first help we can offer to men, women, everyone is to help Ukraine win the war. And secondly, we need to, of course, listen to women's perspectives and tailor or adjust our programs to take those into account. The mechanisms are there. We have to make full use of them. And thirdly, calling out, this again is a little bit more about women as victims, but calling out those atrocities committed specifically targeting women and instrumentalizing sexual violence as a tactic of war. This we need to, I think, talk more about and more openly, in general, specifically to Ukraine as well. Thank you.
In the 5th century AD, we had the killing of the scientist called Hypatia in Alexandria. Maybe you heard about this story. She was a brilliant scientist, she was a mathematician, she represented the power of women, and she represented the power of women against the Orthodox, the religious Orthodox, Christians Orthodox. They killed her. And when they killed her, of course, they killed the opportunity of having real democracy. Because she represented the power of women, but she represented the power of intellect. She represented the values of democracy, equality, gender, opportunities, and of course, a balanced society. And in the 5th century, we then had what we call the Dark Ages for a long time. And maybe it started there, maybe it's not, but we must remind ourselves that the struggle for democracy is a struggle that comes from 3 or 4 millenniums. So today, when we're talking about 2023, it's all about democracy again and not being able to subdue to autocracy. We have to be vigilant, and if you have true democracy, we have equality, and that's it.
Yes, just a quick answer to what Burcu said. You are this way. You are very optimistic. I share something. I have experienced that, but I shared something. Of course, it's about Ukraine to decide. Something that was told to me by a high-level representative from the Ukraine. We have some doubts. Yes, we play very important roles. As I said, Deputy Prime Minister, ministers. But the choice of having women at the table when on the other side you have only men could be perceived as a choice to be weaker than our counterparts. So that's what women said. You have to be, that the government, I mean, now we talk about Ukraine, but it's always the same. You have to really believe that the fact that you are strong and that women represent an added value. If you don't believe in that, the fear that the other part can perceive you as a weaker will bring you to lead you a different choice. And this is also what mediators do. When mediators have to choose and to facilitate the composition of the parties, they will not push too much for having women if this is perceived as an obstacle to reaching an agreement. So at the end, it's not so obvious.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I would like to personally thank all our great speakers, and I would like to ask you to join me, giving me a round of applause to them.
We will now have a 15 minutes coffee break. Coffee break will be served in the main hall. We will resume at 11:25.
We have a picture. If anyone took a picture.
Dois.
Fonseca is a Portuguese name. Are you from Spain?
Yeah, you just feel a bit.
Maybe it's for. We need to finish at 12:50. I cannot forget. Yeah, and I'm sure they will be.
Yeah. My friend background civil engineer. Therefore, also
Madam Minister, Excellency, distinguished guests, dear speakers. What an honor for me to be the moderator of this panel, The Gender Perspective of the War in Ukraine, Preliminary Lessons. And today we have with us Catherine Wright, Ignacio Fonseca, Jenny Mathers, and Olena Suslova. The war against Ukraine is, in fact, a war taking place in the present. But being the present, it is not without a past or a future. And today we will talk about preliminary lessons. For example, what can other countries or organizations learn from Ukraine? How can we be prepared for the following days? The war against Ukraine has had a significant impact on the lives of people living in the region, including women. It is important to understand the gender perspective of the war to better address the needs of all individuals affected, not only women or children. Overall, the gender perspective of the war against Ukraine highlights the importance of recognizing the different needs and experiences of women and men in war zones. It is crucial to involve women in peace-building efforts and to address gender-based violence to promote sustainable peace and security. I cannot disregard that during the Portuguese Overseas War, Portuguese military nurses played an important role in providing medical assistance to soldiers, for example, in Angola and Mozambique. Despite the challenges they faced, Portugal's military nurses were highly respected for their dedication and expertise. So, not wanting to take up any more time, after these brief words, I will pass the floor to our first guest. And our first guest is Catherine Wright, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Newcastle University. Her research focuses on gender and security at NATO. Please, Catherine.
Obrigada, Anna, and to the Minister also for the invitation to speak today. It's really great to see Portugal taking a lead on this important issue. Now, I do have a slide, but I no longer have a clicker. Sorry. So I've been researching NATO's engagement with women, peace and security and with a gender perspective specifically for over a decade now, and I thought what would be useful to do, given the kind of different expertise we have on this panel, is to consider if and how the war in Ukraine is changing NATO's understanding of a gender perspective. So the first thing we need to consider here is, what is a gender perspective? So a gender perspective is a tool, and it's a key to unlock and fully understand any given situation. It stems from the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but of course it concerns not just women, but men too, and people of all genders. To understand what a gender perspective means in the Russia-Ukraine war, we need to consider a couple of questions. First, where are the women? In focusing on women, we are not neglecting men, but often women are less visible, so we need to be conscious in looking for them. Actively looking for women also shows us where the men are and what they're doing. And when we talk about looking for women's perspectives in relation to a gender perspective on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and the first panel touched upon this, it's important also that we prioritise the voices of women on the ground who often aren't heard. We also need to consider what work is gender doing here. So how, for example, are masculinities and femininities invoked in different situations, and to whose benefit and to whose detriment? So, next, to understand how NATO's understanding of a gender perspective might be changed by the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion, we need to consider how it has already evolved. So a gender perspective was first understood through NATO's operations in Afghanistan. Here, a gender perspective became a force multiplier for the alliance. It became essential for understanding and responding to the situation on the ground, including through the deployment of female engagement teams. NATO has also understood the value of a gender perspective for public diplomacy and strategic communications, specifically the value it provides in enabling the communication of key messages to the whole population. One example is where the alliance used Angelina Jolie's high-profile visit to NATO headquarters in 2018 to better communicate its values and purpose to an audience who were not usually engaged with NATO's work as a defence alliance. And that audience NATO was successful in targeting through that visit was women, so half the population. Now, if we turn back to Ukraine, there are 4 elements in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war which have the potential to impact NATO's understanding of a gender perspective. I will highlight and provide an overview of them here, but I believe my fellow panelists, given their expertise, have the ability to unpack these issues further in more detail. First, women, peace and security, and specifically a gender perspective, has been incredibly important building block of NATO's partnership with Ukraine since 2014. In terms of supporting the capacity building of Ukraine's armed forces, including the recruitment of women, and support for the implementation of women, peace and security. Ukraine is not unique here, and NATO has long supported a number of partners to implement a gender perspective. Second, we need to consider the way in which the war is being waged by Russia. This is deeply gendered both on the ground in Ukraine, for example, through the use of conflict-related sexual violence by Russian forces, but also more broadly as an attack on Western values, including freedom, justice, and democracy, but also tellingly gender equality, in part through the promotion of traditional family values. Relatedly, on a strategic level, NATO has had to prioritize a gender perspective in its response to Russian disinformation, which often exploits gender as a lived experience to target men and women differently, so it exploits their weaknesses. Finally, in NATO's support for Ukraine, we also need to consider a gender perspective in understanding how the war is impacting lives on the ground, both in the present during the conflict, but also going forward as we look towards Ukraine as a post-conflict society. Here, a gender perspective involves centering, supporting, and listening to the voices of Ukrainian women on the ground, not just in government offices, who we know are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of supporting their communities and providing vital services. But for this work to be effective in Ukraine as a post-conflict society, and NATO needs to be listening to the voices of Ukrainian women on the ground now, and feeding through their perspectives to ensure that NATO's response and its integration of a gender perspective accounts for the whole of the population. The elevation of women, peace and security to the NATO strategic concept in Madrid last year demonstrates NATO's commitment to implementing a gender perspective, and it provides a real opportunity for the alliance to invest further to fully understand how the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has impacted a gender perspective, and what role a gender perspective might play in responding to that. This seminar is an important part of that conversation, and a gender perspective and thinking about how that informs NATO's response and support for Ukraine is something that the Alliance should prioritise further in the run-up to this summer's summit in Ljubljana this July. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for your approach to the gender perspective concept, to the importance of strategic communication, and also the impact of the war on the ground, the importance of the war, to study the impact of the war on the ground. So now we will have Ignacio Fonseca, is an operational analyst at JALC. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Minister, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, Generals, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here. On behalf of the Commander of the Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center, also known as JALC, I want to thank Your Excellency, the Minister of National Defense, as well as the organizer of the event, Lieutenant Colonel Moraes, for giving the opportunity to the JALC to share some thoughts on how the transformational side of NATO is learning from a gender perspective from this war. For those of you who do not know, the JALC, located here in Monsanto, Lisbon, has a number of mission essential tasks. One of these tasks is to conduct analysis to inform strategic and higher operational decision-making across NATO. JALC has been supporting NATO's efforts to learn from Ukraine since the very beginning of this war. Like all other fellow panelist members here today, my first intention is actually to display the importance of being aware of gender perspective when it comes down to analyzing this war. Secondly, I also would like to highlight the importance of how influence and strategic advantage can be exploited using the gender perspective. And finally, I will share with you some NATO imperatives and how can NATO benefit from gender-related lessons coming from Ukraine in order to support the readiness of our alliance. So in recent time, the transformational side of NATO has been developing its warfare development agenda, which essentially is a 20-year outlook for new strategic thinking. The agenda has 5 warfare development imperatives, and today I would like to focus on how learning from gender-related experiences in Ukraine can inform 2 of those imperatives, namely cognitive superiority and layer resilience. On the one hand, and very briefly, cognitive superiority is the ability to develop deep understanding of oneself and potential adversaries, which is imperative to understand if and how potential adversaries will shape the security environment in their favor while contesting NATO and its values. And on the other hand, and very briefly also, layer resilience ensures the alliance's capacity to sustain long-term competition with potential adversaries by anticipating, absorbing, and adapting to strategic shock or surprise. So now what I would like to do is to share with you some examples from the gender perspective of events that are happening in Ukraine and how the Ukrainians are actually responding to such events. So firstly, on cognitive superiority, as we know, Russia's perception of gender construct in society usually allocates a secondary role for women, especially within the military instrument of power. One must only look at the latest recruitment campaign that the Russians are doing to join their armed forces. The motto of this campaign is "Be a man." Ukraine is exploiting this Russian difference in gender construct by contesting the narratives that show how Russia is effectively undermining the overall capacity of half of its population. At the same time, Ukraine is projecting a narrative to ensure that the entire Ukrainian armed forces, women and men, are responsible for defending their sovereign territory. Another example relates to how Russia has referred to the conscripts that fled the country after the partial mobilization in September 2022. The Russian communication campaign at that stage against those who fled was focused around the concept, the boys have left, but the men have stayed. Ukraine masterfully exploited these Russian messages, reassuring that, in the case of Ukraine, no undermining comparative messages were tolerated within the armed forces of Ukraine and its conscription efforts. Additionally, it is imperative to see how Ukraine is conducting stakeholder analysis from a gender perspective and has identified resisting groups within Russia that are against the war, such as, for example, the feminist anti-war resistant groups, or the group, the Mothers of Russian Soldiers groups, and has exploited these groups in Ukraine's advantage. Finally, Russia has weaponized gender and refugees, just as we heard today, to legitimize its campaign vis-à-vis its own population. One of the Russian information campaigns prior to the invasion was titled Save the Donbas Children, and had the objective to portray Russia as the guardian of traditional patriarchal values in opposition to a decadent and corrupted West, also to include Ukraine. Ukrainians were very skillful in portraying that these types of Russian narratives were in detriment of the rights of women, and countered these narratives by highlighting that Russia effectively categorizes women as a marginalized group within society. Now, if we focus on the concept of layer resilience, there are also a lot of examples coming from Ukraine. As we know, full-scale warfare, as is the case in Ukraine, has demonstrated the very high reliance of the military instrument of power on the civil resilience layer. This is particularly the case in response to the adversary's malicious use of military means to undermine the morale of the civilian population by eroding the comfort tissue of basic needs, such as, for example, when we have seen the Russians targeting the energy infrastructure. So, as Ukrainians have learned, response to these types of attacks are mostly conducted by the civil sector and must be planned, resourced, and executed, taking into account the needs for different gender and age groups. A major element also to be taken into account when we're talking about layer resilience is the psychological sphere of one's own population. Russia has been making conscious and strategic use of conflict-related sexual violence, as we've heard today, to undermine the morale of the Ukrainian population. Additionally, for longer-lasting conflicts, such as the one in Ukraine right now, societal support is a key element for perseverance. When the societal support, which is of paramount importance, it is of paramount importance to have sex and age disaggregated data for societal support, because that way the military and the civil sector can adequately nurture the different elements of the civilian society to be able to sustain support for the military effort in the long term. So if we're looking at Ukraine, there are a lot of examples coming from civilian groups in Ukraine that are trying to provide the adequate support to the civilians in need based on the difference in gender and age when people are asking for help and when they are in need. Finally, there's also very interesting views that are being analyzed from a gender perspective on how mobilization and conscription laws are being thought about or are thought about both in Russia and in Ukraine. Although in complete different degrees, mobilization and conscription laws are mostly targeted at the male population, and we also heard that from the general today. So this means that there continues to be a view that men are expected to fight, even in cases when they have no prior military training. So after all these examples, the question is NATO, or at least the transformational side of NATO, learning something from a gender perspective out of the conflict or the war in Ukraine? Well, the answer to this question, I can assure you, it's definitely yes. First of all, NATO is learning to perceive the importance that the gender perspective has in practical terms within an existing conflict, and how gender perspective can actually be exploited to achieve own advantages, just like the Ukrainians are doing. Specifically for cognitive superiority, NATO is learning, first of all, to gather awareness of how the Russian gender-related narratives are being exploited by the Ukrainians. Secondly, NATO is learning to acquire much deeper and broader understanding of Russian gender-related constructs, and most importantly, NATO is learning to be prepared to integrate gender perspectives in NATO's long-term military strategic shaping. Now, if we go to layer resilience, we're also learning there. First of all, NATO should assume that, very unfortunately, malicious state actors are going to make calculated use of targeting civilian infrastructure, and they're going to make conscious use of conflict-related sexual violence to undermine the psychological morale of the population. Therefore, proper military and civil planning, executing, and resourcing needs to be thought about in order, when there's a response that needs to happen, that it is adequately responding to that civil infrastructure being taken out or those civilians being affected. Additionally, fostering and ensuring sex and age disaggregated data is paramount for the adequate planning for resilience-related work strands, and specifically to ensure adequate social support for preservance efforts. And finally, and in order to ensure effective layer resilience, it would be very much of interest to analyze how the mobilization and conscription laws are thought about within the different NATO countries, especially to see and to understand if they are fitted to anticipate and adapt to the warfare and social realities that we are facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your... Thank you so much for your interesting approach to these to concepts, cognitive superiority and layered resilience. So, and now we'll have Jenny Matters, a researcher with focus mainly in two areas: Russian politics and security, and gender and conflict. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your attention, and thank you especially to the organizers for inviting me to address you today. I'm going to focus on Russia and how Russia's leaders and the Russian state are using gender in its war in Ukraine. Gender is central to the way that Putin and his government understand the war in Ukraine. It defines the way that Putin and other officials and the state-controlled media present Russian interest in Ukraine and construct a narrative around the Russian invasion, and indeed Russia's military intervention in Ukraine since 2014. At the heart of this narrative is the idea that Russia is engaged in a war of values, as we've already heard, against the collective West, which it is fighting in Ukraine. This is based on the claim that Russia is a champion of traditional family values, which is one of Russia's few successful attempts to exercise soft power. Although, as I'll show in a few minutes, that claim rings a bit hollow when you investigate it more closely. To a large extent, this is about opposition to LGBTQ people, refusing to acknowledge that lesbians, gays, bisexual, trans, and queer people have human rights, and creating an increasingly hostile legal and social environment for them to exist. Gay men and women and trans and queer people are depicted as degenerate and unnatural, and as a symptom of a wider malaise that affects the West and that Ukraine is also infected by. So the West, and also Ukraine, are depicted in this narrative as lacking a moral compass, not understanding the difference between right and wrong, or perhaps understanding that difference, but choosing to do what is wrong over what is right. We should also be aware that this category of people who are degenerate and unnatural is extended to feminists, who are depicted as women who have lost their real purpose in life, which is to be feminine and beautiful, to marry and become mothers and grandmothers, and who instead go around behaving in ways that are irrational and inappropriate. This narrative is aimed not only at domestic audiences in Russia, but also at Ukrainians who live in territories occupied by Russia and at the wider world. And it has found receptive audiences in parts of the global south, in places with very socially conservative, often very religious leaders and societies. It has also found receptive audiences in parts of Europe and North America, especially among socially and politically conservative communities, political parties and leaders who use culture wars as a way of attaining and holding on to political power. It's worth pointing out that this narrative predates the start of Russia's military intervention in Ukraine in 2014, but it's become much more prominent since then. So this phrase at the top of the slide, toxic masculinity, is a core Russian value. Unfortunately, I can't claim to be the person who coined that phrase. That was Olga Oliker from the Crisis Group, but she said I could use it. But it captures another important aspect of how Russia uses gender to fight the war in Ukraine, and that's the role of masculinity. Masculinity is the key to the way that Putin sees himself personally and as a leader, and by extension, the way that he sees Russia as a state. And this view is shared by other Russian officials. An important component in this narrative of Putin's significance as a leader is that he, a strong masculine figure, brought Russia out of a period of humiliation, the 1990s, when it was weak and taken advantage of by the West. According to this logic, if Russia is to avoid falling back into the ways of the 1990s, it has to be tough and masculine and behave like a real man. This involves belligerence towards other states, especially those in the West. It also involves the threat and the use of military force to take and keep what Russia wants or what it claims belongs to Russia. One of the ways that this state masculinity reveals itself is in decisions and representations about who should participate in this war. The image at the top of the slide is a screenshot taken from a recent Russian military recruiting video, which has already been mentioned. The video depicts 3 Russian men doing ordinary jobs in the civilian economy, and it suggests that these are not the jobs of real men. It then shows these same men putting on military uniforms and carrying weapons, telling them, and men in the audience, "You're a real man, be one." In other words, the way to be a real man and fulfill your purpose in life is to become a soldier. In sharp contrast, the appropriate space for Russia's women in this war is marginalized and very stereotypically feminine. The image at the bottom of the slide shows a Russian war widow. She's draped in her dead husband's uniform and she holds his medal. It's one of a series of such images that are being put forward in state-controlled Russian media. Mourning the dead is one of the few acceptable public roles left for women. This sense of squeezing women out of the war is reflected in other ways too. There's almost no interest in recruiting women for the armed forces, for example. Russia's war in Ukraine has created severe shortages of military personnel. But neither the recruitment campaigns looking for volunteers to come forward, nor the September mobilization, when the state called on citizens to do their duty and serve, targeted women as possible soldiers. A very small number of women have been mobilized, mainly medics, and a small proportion of women soldiers are accepted for voluntary service, but the overwhelming emphasis has been on getting men into uniform and onto the front lines. 2 research projects that I'm working on currently confirm this observation, that the space for Russian women in this war is very marginal. One of these projects looks at Russia's soldiers' mothers and their attitudes and actions in relation to the war, as well as the state's depiction of them. My colleague from Aberdeen University, Dr. Natasha Danilova, and I have found that in the Russian state-controlled media, soldiers' mothers have been almost entirely written out of reports about this war. The phrase soldiers' mothers is almost never mentioned, and instead there's a new phrase being used, which is families of the mobilized. This, we think, reflects the fact that soldiers' mothers were historically troublesome and disruptive, challenging the state and fighting for the rights of conscripts. On the rare occasions when they are mentioned, the mothers and wives of soldiers are described as engaging in feminized actions, such as knitting socks with soldiers at the front, or being proud of their soldier husbands or sons, or mourning their loss. The new phrase, families of the mobilized, is found in legal descriptions of the state's obligation to soldiers and their next of kin, for example, to pay financial compensation if they are killed in service. This, we think, suggests a symbolic parenthood on the part of the state, which writes out not only soldiers' mothers, but also their whole biological families. This makes Russia's claims to support the traditional family values sound rather hollow. The second research project involves the militarization of Russian children, and I'm working on that with Dr. Alison Edwards at Bath Spa University. We're looking at the role played by patriotic organizations created for young people, like the Youth Army and the Victory Volunteers. And we're finding that as part of a wider effort to get children to identify with military values and with the war in Ukraine, veterans of the Second World War are routinely held up as heroes for the children to admire. But men and women veterans are presented very differently. When the youth groups present men who are veterans, there's an emphasis on providing all the details of their wartime service. Which units did they serve in? Which battles did they participate in? Which medals did they receive? And so on. When the groups present women who are veterans, they deal with their wartime accomplishments very quickly. usually just in a sentence. She was a sniper. And then they move on to talk about how the women married after the war, became mothers and grandmothers. So even as historical figures to motivate and inspire children, women are confined to a very narrow space, which in turn sends an important signal to the girls who belong to these youth groups about what their roles are likely to be in the future. Russia is using gender to make certain actions and attitudes seem normal and natural, and others seem impossible. I always tell my students that this is gender superpower. It makes social relations, which are very carefully constructed and maintained through constant effort, seem effortless, normal, and natural. Of course, it is men who are soldiers and women sit on the sidelines. Of course, a state has to be tough and strong and use military force to be respected in the world. Putin and other Russian policymakers use gender as a way of explaining how they see themselves, how they see the state, how they see those people who should be fighting this war on Russia's behalf, how they see the enemy, and also how they see the future. They use gender to describe the way that the world should be organized and the way that it would be organized if Russia were in control. In using gender to marginalize and dehumanize individuals, communities, and nations, whether we're talking about LGBTQ individuals, women who refuse to accept their rightful place in society, or a country and a nation such as Ukraine, which has embraced values such as democracy, tolerance, and human rights. Russia is using gender to define who has the right to belong, to have agency, to be admired and respected, which severely narrows the space for those who do not fit in some way or other. The Russian state is trying to create a society in a very particular gendered image. Finally, I want to make 2 points about the gap between the gendered Kremlin narrative and reality. First, the appeal to masculinity as a way of attracting Russian men to join the armed forces is not working. Increasingly, the state is having to shift the emphasis towards financial incentives, offering perhaps 5 times the average salary, short-term contracts, and significant benefits to families for soldiers killed in the war. This means that Russia's armed forces are increasingly staffed by men whose families are in serious economic need. Finally, we need to recognize that by setting up this gendered hierarchy of who is the appropriate soldier, Russia is denying itself a really important human resource in fighting this war, and that's women. The narratives created by the Russian state and its supporters almost entirely write women out of the story of this war, and indeed even the memory of the Second World War, or relegate them to a narrow space of stereotypically feminized actions. This is in sharp contrast to Ukraine, which has moved quickly to remove legal obstacles to women serving in the armed forces and acknowledges their presence and contributions from the very top of the political leadership. Thank you.
Such an interesting approach, this time regarding the narrative used in this war, the power of them. So because we are aware of that, I do believe that the strategic communication is one of the keys that we need to work on. So, and we will move on to the last speech, which will be followed by the discussion. So Alina Zuzlova is dedicated to the human rights, is a gender activist and a researcher. She works on the WPS agenda since 2010. And Alina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the invitation and for the organization of this seminar. Actually, all previous speakers said many things that echoed in my presentation, and I thought maybe I needn't have to go here because everything important about Ukraine you said. No, it is important because I would like to hear it. The year we have lived has presented us with many challenges, many of which we never planned to face in our lives. To leave houses and organize it in the new place, to run in the shelter during the alarm and to provide training there, every day to lose friends, colleagues, civilians and military people, and communicate to the CRSV survivors. The year taught us many skills that we never planned to use either. Making trench candles and weaving protective nets for the army, living without light, heat and water and working full-time all these days. Actually, classes, lessons, what we learned during the year, first of all, for us, for our practical actions. At the same time, I think my presentation also will echo for you as well because I think it is very important for alliances such NATO, EU, and others. We know 4 pillars of the 1325 resolution, and I also mentioned 4 of these pillars in my presentation. First of all, about prevention. For 4 years before the start of the war and 9 years during the war, 13 years in general, I researched and constantly talked about the fact that gender-based violence is growing in Russia, tolerance for its growing as well, and efforts to promote this approach to other countries, in particular to Ukraine, but not only, are intensifying. As an example, the global campaign against the Istanbul Convention, instead of direct targeting the idea of protection from the violence, they targeted so-called gender threats to humanhood. The conflict-related sexual violence, its form, and accompanying manifestations of violence demonstrate the result of this policy for Russia. The mass support of war rapes in Russian society, in particular by women, is a confirmation of the existence of these consequences. What we have to do? We have to analyze, we have to plan the inclusion of the deep and multilateral gender perspective in all security and defense spheres, in strategic, operational, and tactical planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. To develop and strengthen methods and tools for the counteraction. I am ready to share all details for this topic for interested in this point. These lessons are for both of us, not only for Ukraine. Opposition to so-called anti-gender hybrid Russian actions in Ukraine has turned into an influential factor of the general resilience of society, and I absolutely agree with everything what Ignacio mentioned in this area. The important role is the cooperation of the security service of Ukraine and civil society on these issues. Quick response to security needs of a different nature than in previous years. Usually I tell about operationalization of gender, not just to talk at very important events about it, but to know how to operationalize it, how to use the tool. The unprecedentedly operative development of the assistance mechanism for the conflict-related sexual violence survivors in Ukraine is all a demonstration of the consequence of such readiness. Next one, participation. More than 40,000 women serve in the Ukrainian army. In percentage, this is more than in many armies of the NATO member countries, and you said about it actually. Encouraging women to serve in the army, changes in service conditions, development of a gender policy in the security and defense sector, cooperation on gender issues between the military and feminist civil society organization. All this relates specifically to the participation of women in peace-building processes. However, in this aspect, we have discussions with the feminist community of different countries when all this is a reason to accuse us, Ukrainian feminists, of contribution to the militarization of the country, of the society. Our position is different. The country has a right to protection. Women have the right to defend their country, as they have the right to defend themselves. To accuse us in what we are doing is the same as accuse a woman who is threatened with violence, with rape, when she defends herself. When feminists claim otherwise, this is, in our opinion, is a reflection of so-called colonial feminism, which considers the situation only from the position of possible aggressor country. What we have to do? I think we have to have discussions because many of such differences, they are because feminism is also need for reflection, for practical reflection and consideration with practical situation. Protection. I have to tell here about conflict-related sexual violence. Since the April of past year, I'm working as a specialist with the investigators in this area. We work as an organization with survivors. We work with SEMA network. It is a global network of survivors. And I think, despite all awful suffering for survivors, we have very good lessons from these situations. I mentioned already on the immediate reaction to these cases, not full, not comprehensive, not efficient sometimes, yet, however, very fast. The experience we collected demonstrated gaps related to the counteraction to the gender-based violence in general, domestic violence, sexual harassments, etc. And I think many of these classes could be interested also not only for Ukraine, but for other countries. And finally, reconciliation. Recovery plan for Ukraine. Irene, my great friend, mentioned about it, and I agree with everything you said, Irene. We consider EU and NATO as a friends, as a good friends. We have to tell one to each other not only good things, but other things that could be different. And talking about inclusion women in the negotiation process, inclusion of the gender component in the recovery process, we ask you support to advocate our government and secretly to advocate you governments as well sometimes, because it is very important for us. When before the Lugano conference, we looked for the support in different countries of the EU who could support us in our inclusion of gender component. Maybe our voice was not so loud, we didn't find it. Reconciliation is not possible without justice. Justice is not possible without gender perspective. Reparations as a transitional justice mechanism include guarantees of non-repetition and should include some specific measures. All these measures should be included in the Capitulation Act of Russia and other document of post-Russia changes. It is not just good declaration. I think conflict-related sexual violence, violence against civilian population in general, has roots in the patriarchat. And we have to operationalize it is as well. Because without these tools, we can't look for other society in peace. Ukraine, women in Ukraine, we are not victims. We are survivors. Feel the difference. We think how to foster results for the preliminary lessons and to convert it in the post-war recovery of Ukraine. And answering at the Monica's question about the greatest danger for women in Ukraine, I would like to tell the greatest danger for women and men in Ukraine today is to lose our country under the heel of Putin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech and for your words, a little bit emotional, but at the same time very, very realistic about what can we do. And yeah, in Ukraine, women are not victims, are survivors. Thank you also for that. After these four speeches, we certainly have reasons to be able to discuss the topic that we have for this panel, but like Diana did before, yeah, we have time for questions from the audience, and if you don't mind, as a warm-up, I will start. So I will start with Olena. And related to gender's perspective of war, in your opinion, what are the lessons learned by Ukraine?
The main lesson maybe women become more and more less secondary part of population in Ukraine.
Thank you so much. And Catherine, in terms of NATO, how the war in Ukraine is changing gender perspective?
I think another aspect that I didn't perhaps touch on is actually thinking about, and we were kind of having discussions about this morning, thinking about security as more than kind of hostilities not happening, but also thinking about the importance of emotional or ontological security of the population at the moment and how that impacts men and women differently, because that's going to be incredibly, and this is why it's important to have women's involvement in the settlement and the negotiations, an end to the conflict, because emotional security impacts men and women differently. And I'm thinking here of a lesson that perhaps we can learn from a post-conflict society within NATO, and at the time when the hostilities ceased there, it was within the European Union as well, which is Northern Ireland. So 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, which brought an end to the fighting and brought the two opposing sides together to agree. But what was missing there was a consideration of kind of women's perspectives, a gender perspective, and a consideration of emotional security. So the fighting may have stopped, but actually there's still kind of huge difficulties in Northern Ireland. And in terms of the impact of the lack of emotional security, we can see that Northern Ireland currently, I believe, has kind of the highest suicide rate among European states. So the fighting has stopped, but actually people are still dying. So this is kind of I think when we're talking about the gender perspective in the moment, and when NATO is talking about it in the moment, it needs to look also to the future, because what NATO does now has an impact on what kind of the future looks like, and to ensure that ontological and emotional security are considered, as well as kind of more kind of hard military understandings of what security is.
Thank you. Now I ask if anyone in the audience wants to raise a question or even make a comment. Yep. Just 1 minute. Yeah, it's better with the micro.
Yes, good afternoon already. My name is Sven Rebaum. I'm the gender advisor from Strike for NATO based here in Oeiras in Portugal. I have a question for Olena. You were talking about gender-based violence and collecting cases and trying to make some courses and training for the people there. Are you including male and females, or is it just for females, and especially for cases that are also linked to males in the war zone? So are you collecting both sides of the cases, let me say it like that, or is it just linked to female cases?
Thank you for your question. We work for both, for women and men, mostly for women, because women are more in quantity, and also talking about training what we are doing for security and defense sector. 50-50 actually for all structures that we work. It depends from structure to structure, because community officers or patrol police or investigators, they have different percentage of women and men, but we work for all, and we pay attention at gender stereotypes of communication to seriously survivors if we see it, because we have, from our experience, we have about 30 different scenarios what we do give them and what have some similar tendencies in this area.
That was the answer I would really like to hear. Thank you very much.
At the same time, we lack psychologists of male CRSV survivors. And it is a very big problem because stigma of masculinity.
Thank you. These are my experience from my mission in South Sudan, that the, let me say, the male gender-based violence is shut down. Nobody's talking about it, and and that is a very difficult issue because the tribes in Africa, they are relying on both sides, of the male and female, and if they have let me say, they are branded with a stigma, the tribal community is not working anymore.
Yeah. Recently, we have the first non-governmental organization, charitable foundation of male survivors of CRSV for male survivors of the CRSV. And we think it is really very, very good for all of us because many reasons in this area.
Do we have any further questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I would like to ask Catherine Wright, because you mentioned a lot the question of strategic narratives and the gender dimensions of those. And I'd like to ask you if the use of this civilizational discourse in NATO, but also in the EU, strategic narrative on the WPS agenda not ends up like compromising feminist visions of the security that were at the beginning of the emergence of WPS. And I'm thinking about this distinction and this constant hierarchy between the global north and the global south, and the latter is always positioned as the one that needs to learn the lessons and to comply, and not as complete agents in defining what WPS means in practice. So I'm asking you what can be done to move past these hierarchies in a more practical and strategic way. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. So I've published on both NATO and the EU's use of women, peace and security in terms of strategic narratives, and critiqued that from a feminist perspective. So my headline takeaway would be, don't just talk about the women on International Women's Day. Women are there the other 364 days of the year. But I think you're concerned that actually the kind of use instrumentally of WPS in strategic narratives can undermine kind of the feminist aspirations behind the agenda is a really important one. So there's one point on that is to kind of mainstream a gender perspective into all strategic communications so that it's clear, but also reflects inward. So are we just talking about kind of, so that it's not just about talking about NATO or the EU helping states or countries, third countries, particularly in the global south, but it's also about ensuring that the women within kind of NATO and the EU come to prominence, but also ensuring that those communications have integrity. So there's one example, and NATO kind of since changed this. This is over a decade ago now that this came out. NATO produced a very effective strategic communication campaign called Return to Hope, which was telling NATO's story of Afghanistan. And part of that story and part of the campaign was about the work that NATO had done to support Afghan women. And it played into all kind of the tropes that you point to of being kind of very essentializing of Afghan women and presenting them as victims. But the other issue with this video, which was on YouTube, which formed part of the campaign, so this is a story about how NATO had empowered Afghan women, was there were no Afghan women in it. Okay, so NATO has learnt a lot since then and has come a long way in the last decade, but there's still a danger of speaking for women in countries that NATO is trying to support, rather than listening to and giving a platform to them. And obviously there's lessons to be learnt there for Ukraine. So thank you, excellent question.
Thank you. We have one more question over there. The micro, please. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this discussion. Also, this perspective of psychologists in terms of male sufferers or survivors has rung a bell with me, and I'll take that back when we're looking at our psychological rehabilitation project as well. I wanted to ask a question to the panel, but it's really inspired by what Jenny said. It just crystallized for me. The Global South is one of the places where we find less support for Ukraine, or rather more reticence, and they seem to be really open to Russian disinformation and narratives. And the way you described how the male or masculinity plays well with those audiences, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts what we can do to counter that.
That's a good practical question. Academics tend to avoid practical questions, and we want to go for the discussing of all the problems and the issues. It is a tricky one. I think presenting alternative and more attractive views of what masculinity can be is one possible pathway. So showing, the caring, more nurturing side of masculinity is a possibility. I mean, I have a PhD student who's working on looking at the way that Wagner Group, the private military company in Russia, appeals to different audiences in different parts of Africa. It's really interesting because they definitely target certain kinds of masculinity in their recruitment campaigns, trying to get Africans to join Wagner Group and work with them. And so this idea of firstly understanding the local context, understanding again, going back to an earlier question about, not assuming what's happening elsewhere, but understanding what's happening elsewhere, and how do you tap into certain values and certain needs, about what kind of messages you give and who are you appealing to. I mean, appealing to women in some ways as well as appealing to men, but showing a more holistic kind of view of what masculinity can be. It's not just being tough and mean and brutal. Might be a possible way forward. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. So as everything in life, you always try to look and convince your sphere of influence. So that's actually what the Russians are doing, just like we are doing. And it's much easier to convince a similar mindset than yours in this regard. And this is exactly what the Russians are doing from a communication point of view in parts of Africa and in other parts of the world, because they know that's their sphere of influence to convince those countries easier than we have. So since we have to look at this also holistically, sometimes if we look at it only from the gender perspective, we might not be able to influence those countries that much. However, if we look at it from another instrument of power, whenever a nation goes to negotiate with an African nation, and in the negotiation they provide for economic needs, they can always convince that nation, hey, look, if you want our support, this is something that we can give you towards it. So I think we have to look at this, especially when countering gender narratives from Russia in their sphere of influence nations. We need to look at it more holistically, not only from the gender perspective. So, I know Brussels is doing that, so that's also good. So that's probably my answer to the question.
Other comments? No?
I think it is important, I agree with colleagues, it is important to analyze tools, what Russia used. It used not only for such kind of gender perspective, it used for other things, because media, clericalism, and other part of so-called structural violence are doing this work not only in this area. It is about ethnicities, it is about other things, and I think the holistic approach, what Jenny mentioned, has to have all these things. Peter Selznick wrote in 50 years of past century the book Organizational Weapon, Strategy and Tactics of Bolsheviks. Trust me, nothing changed.
Diana, please.
Well, thank you all for your great presentations. I also have a question to Jenny, because it really struck me in your presentation from your research that Russia is keeping their intention of not involving women in the armed forces. First, because throughout history we have seen that whenever there is a war and there is a need for human resource, the countries also call up for women. And also during World War II, the Soviet Union did it. There were female pilots. They were even called by the Allies as the Night Witches. So do you think, from what you've been studying, that Russia will be able to continue to maintain that goal of not involving women, or at some point during the lack of human resources that they have within the armed forces, they will have to give up and then start mobilizing women? Thank you.
That's a really good question. And it's interesting because it speaks to the way that the Kremlin's narrative is moving further and further away from reality and the needs of reality and the needs of the country if it's going to continue fighting this war. And I think if we see Russia make a turn, make a shift in that narrative and say, actually we need women, I think it's going to be a really important moment, because it will reflect the idea that Russia is losing, and that Russia understands that it's losing, because to shift from this such a strong focus on masculinity as the whole reason for the war and the whole reason why people fight, to an understanding that actually women are needed, I think that's going to indicate a shift in understanding of the leadership, and it could be a really crucial point.
Any more questions? Yes, one more.
Thank you so much. My name is Irina Shkira. I represent Ukrainian Hub. We are an NGO that empowers women from social and economical perspective, and we recently concluded our pilot program to help refugee Ukrainian women who want to start their businesses. And our participants came from various parts of Ukraine, and they have projects in very different areas. But what unites them, and this is something that Ms. Elena actually mentioned, is that they don't want to be perceived as victims of war. They want to be perceived as survivors, and they want to be perceived as active social and economic agents. And I was wondering, what are the members of the panel thoughts on how we could change this narrative, what we could do more, maybe more programs similar to ours. Maybe there are already programs that you could share. I would really be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ignacio, do you want to start?
It's tough for the NATO member to start this question,
yes.
But thank you for putting me up to the challenge. Well, I think the most important thing is to have a mindset shift in the fact of trying not to speak about women or men. It's actually human capital. And if you're a nation, and if you are a smart nation, you exploit 100% of your human capital, irrespective of the gender. And that also shift in mentality, but also in narrative, is very important. So trying to target from a national perspective or from a company perspective, trying to exploit the human capital will enhance your opportunities for equality, rather than trying to always say, okay, this is for men, this is for women. So I think also that would be my 2 cents, without not knowing too much about the topic. So.
Yeah, so I think my kind of 2 cents on that, and I think this is a really important point, that Ukrainian women need to be kind of presented as survivors and given their agency. And just to go back to kind of strategic communication, so I guess from kind of NATO and the EU, and also kind of member states perspective, I think there's kind of a role there. So we see a lot in terms of kind of the kind of response, highlighting conflict-related sexual violence, which obviously is important, but as much as that's being talked about, we also need to be talking about kind of the role that Ukrainian women are playing in kind of keeping wartime Ukraine going, and kind of being on the front line, kind of taking up arms, but also kind of those broader roles within civil society. So I think that element could be kind of further integrated in terms of public diplomacy and strategic communications.
No, do you want?
Thank you, Irina, for your question. Actually, a Ukrainian proverb tells, good done, but served. And I think it is very often about us, and Irene mentioned it as well, that our women who are decision makers, who are successful business women, who are successful in other areas are less visualized. We have to visualize it all together. Thank you.
You want to comment?
Yes, certainly. I think I would say yes, there's definitely, if you think about the communications, public relations side, which can come from governments and international organizations, and also the media. I think, there's been quite a lot in the media about, the pain and suffering of Ukrainian women. But I think more stories around their agency and the contributions that they're making to the societies and the communities that they're living in now outside Ukraine and their aspirations for return and so on, I think those would be really important too.
Thank you. We have, yes.
I think the role of the media is incredibly important, and actually we don't see the stories that we should about Ukrainian women as survivors and agents. And I've got a very short anecdote to tell about that. I was approached by a New York Times journalist last summer who wanted to write a story about Ukrainian women. And I said, well, this is the story you need to write. It's about Ukrainian women's agency. And through various networks, kind of put them in touch with some Ukrainian women. They couldn't get it past their editors. So there's this huge silence, and there's the role of kind of gatekeepers in stopping these stories getting out. But the media is also influenced by what governments and what our international organizations prioritize. And if they're prioritizing telling the story of women, Ukrainian women as survivors, then the media is going to pick up interest in it. So the two aren't separable. We're all accountable for this, and we're all culpable for it.
Thank you. We have one more question. Madam Minister, please.
Well, thank you very much. I have so many questions, but I promise I won't ask them all. Just wanted to, sign off, first of all, the fact that I realize now why when Diana came to me proposing the seminar from the Equality Office of the Ministry of Defense, this is really important because we haven't been talking about this, and obviously from your presentations, we realize how much there is to reflect, to not only understand the dynamics of the war, but most of all, to understand how to build resilience and what to do next if we want to really have some kind of positive consequences in terms of the reconstruction, etc. So thank you very much to all of you for helping us understand these gender dynamics of the war in Ukraine, not only in its material expression, but also the narrative dimension that is as important in this war as the material one. I think we are all better aware of how it works, and so better prepared to also reflect on resilience and on reconstruction, hopefully soon. My question is relates to the lessons learned dimension. You all mentioned this. One of the questions of this seminar is, what can we learn from this while happening in order to test our own instruments and policies and institutions, the way we address these kind of gender perspectives? And it's for all of you, but mainly thinking about Ignacio's work in JALC. To what extent do you think that NATO will be able to learn from all these lessons that you so I think wisely mentioned already in this follow-up already in Vilnius? But for all of you, can we really learn from this? What does it take to incorporate into our policies what we have learned so far? Thank you.
If I may, NATO has a lessons learned capability, and one of the most important things of the capability is actually leadership involvement. So whenever the lessons are identified or actually even learned, it is also up to the leadership in each of the segments of NATO to implement those lessons. That's why if you look at the NATO lessons learned capability, leadership is the foundation of that. So our work in the transformational side of the alliance is actually to ensure that all the lessons are captured, especially the ones from inside NATO are captured, and then fed to the leaderships across the alliance, both military and civilians. Yes, I'm looking at you, Mr.
Thank you. Jenny, please.
Okay, thank you. I would say that the case that I presented of Russia is an extreme case, but we should all see ourselves in some aspects of this case, right? So every time a woman in the military is made to feel uncomfortable that she doesn't belong, or every time that there's a suggestion that perhaps she should give sexual favors to a commander. And this happens in militaries around the world. It happens in militaries in NATO. And so I think we have to really, really from the top, but also from a very organic way in terms of training and military culture, address this systematically among ourselves. I think in a line, we should be less Russia and be more Ukraine.
So I think that kind of building on Ignacio and Jenny, so we've got lessons learned and we've got kind of reflection. And I think just to build on both of those, we also need to do a bit of kind of capacity building in terms of... Thank you, Siri. This always happens. In terms of... She's listening to me. In terms of, so I'm thinking how those lessons are received. So it's all very well collecting the lessons, and that should be done. But actually, if the senior decision makers and actually the mid-level decision makers don't understand what a gender perspective is or what WPS is, then that's pointless. So we also need to do kind of capacity building. And if we don't do that, then I think we're also playing into Russia's hands, because there's a danger that women, peace and security just becomes understood as about women as victims, which is part of it, but that's also the narrative that Russia plays at the Security Council to undermine the women, peace and security agenda. So this comes back to the reflection element. So my key thing would be capacity building at senior and mid-level within kind of defence forces and within kind of NATO and the EU decision making.
We continue to collect our lessons because we have a lot. We try to immediately to respond. If to tell about some more general questions, the main lesson for us is never, never, never give up. And it is important also, next lesson is, for us it is very important to insist when we were not heard. Because if I did 14 years this researches and advocacy, I had to be more insisting, more convincing, more practical. Also, one more important thing that also I heard today. It is about 24 hours and 7 days of our work now. It is about vicarious trauma of evidence. Everyone in Ukraine has it now. And we started to work with police, with armed forces, with security and defense sector, and with civilians. We have to care ourselves, because we have no right to die from traumas. We lost so many people, really, and it is important for us, because the population of Ukraine is already exist. And we have to think how to reconstruct, how to do recovery when we lost so many people. Some of them left our countries, and we understand they will not return back, because it's also part of their trauma. Many people we lost at the battlefield. So, thank you. many lessons. However, we try to be excellent in our work, what we are doing.
Thank you. Time flies, and it's time to summarize, or at least I will try to summarize what have been said. So one preliminary lesson that can be drawn from the gender perspective of the war in Ukraine is that women have been disproportionately affected by the war. Women are more likely to be displaced and are at a greater risk of violence and sexual assault during times of war. They are survivors. Additionally, women often face unique challenges related to access to healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. Another lesson is that women have been actively involved in peace building. Women's organizations have been instrumental in providing support to those affected by the war and advocating for their rights. Women have also been involved in the negotiations and peace talks, with some playing key roles in brokering agreements. Never, never give up. As I said before, it is important to note that the potential benefits of women's participation in war should never outweigh the potential risks and harms they may face. To ensure the safety and well-being of all individuals, regardless of gender, during times of war, efforts should be made. Overall, the war against Ukraine has had a significant impact on the lives of women in the country, with many facing displacement, violence, economic hardship, and other challenges. We need to learn how to handle with all of this. We need to learn how to avoid with discrimination in general. We need to learn how to get the best that we all have, men, women, and others. So again, thank you so much for your participation in this event. In my opinion, if I may, it would be better if we had not needed to talk about these issues. Assuming that there is a need to talk about gender and discrimination, it is because it exists. And that's not good. It's not good at all. So, however, as long as there are people interested in talking about the subject, this issue will not be forgotten, and together we can make a difference. The first woman president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mirjana, said in New York regarding gender equality and war, "No humanity, dignity, peace until international humanitarian law is upheld for all genders." Thank you.
To deliver the closing remarks of this seminar, we will now give the floor to the Portuguese Secretary of State for National Defense, Marco Capitão Ferreira.
Good afternoon, Minister of National Defense, General Chief of Army Staff, ambassadors, representatives of the Portuguese Armed Forces, Chief of General Staff and Chiefs of Navy and Air Force Staff, directors and representatives of the Ministry of Defense, officers, distinguished speakers and moderators of this international seminar, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to underline the courage to broach such a difficult subject while reality is still happening around us. This excellent work that was done here today is of immense value. These discussions will allow us to better understand the subject of the utmost importance. As our Minister of National Defense often says, equality is more than a constitutional right. It must also be a collective purpose in a democratic context, allowing both men and women to be fully integrated in society with the same opportunities. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 confronts us with the need to assess our ability to defend ourselves and the implications of a range of capabilities for modern warfare. As a consequence of this war, we are deep diving into a vast ocean of technological development with exponential discoveries in fields only matched by their disruptive potential. Such discoveries must take into account women, peace and security, and gender perspective. These are key elements that must be included in our strategic response to an illegal war that is being fought not only in territorial and geographical terms, but which fundamentally constitutes an attack on our democratic values, such as individual liberty, human rights, and the rule of law. The constant threats to the way we decide to organize our society should also lead us to collectively discuss how to deter them. Gender perspectives cannot be separated from these discussions. The way that they have impacted the ongoing war must be taken into account when assessing these issues. When considering the highly gendered nature of war, we should pursue a more in-depth understanding of how new and more advanced patterns of warfare affect entire populations, how women, men, girls, boys can differently influence and be impacted by threats to our security due to their gender. The ability to analyze this war through a gender perspective should enable us to conduct a better, comprehensive analysis of its different components, allowing us to better predict, prevent, and mitigate risks to our operations in the future. The way forward requires that we invest on and promote solutions to counter disinformation promoted by those that want to destroy our values. Russia and its allies often frame gender equality as a threat to culture and traditional values, placing not only NATO and the European Union as a political and military threat, but also the democratic world order as a threat to Russian interests and their way of living. Men, women, boys and girls are often targeted by Russian disinformation campaigns. These campaigns usually send out the message that NATO membership will entail the loss of traditional or so-called traditional values and forced acceptance of things that are described as Western gender norms and which are attributed with the decay of society. Furthermore, these disinformation campaigns and promotions of true and traditional European values is seen as a strategy to destabilize the European Union, where Europe is portrayed as a continent in chaos and decline, and in which gender ideology, whatever there is, increasingly appears in connection with Europe and is allowed to symbolize a stand-in for Western geopolitical strategy. Russia has intentionally targeted and exploited societal gender fault lines through hybrid warfare as a reliable tactic for destabilizing cohesion and unity among populations throughout Europe. Estimates point that the Kremlin budget allocated to the disinformation campaigns in 2021 was just a bit over 1.3 billion euros. This hostile strategic communication approach of framing gender ideology as a threat and appeasing to far-right groups, mainly in Europe, is arguably an issue of increasing relevance to European security. In order to stop it, there must be a strong and cohesive strategy throughout NATO allies and within the European Union, with enough resources preventing the far-right agenda to prevail over human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, I believe it is up to us to defend our values and counter disinformation strategies disseminated by those that seek to undermine our values. A part of our response must go through achieving the promise of Resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council, and reaffirm the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts. If we fail to achieve this, we are depriving ourselves of the means to achieve peace. Integrating gender perspective in everything we do requires a long-term commitment and bold steps at the highest levels, often where men are the decision makers. Not always, just often. Women are essential to identifying durable and inclusive solutions that can lead to sustainable peace and to identify the needs of those on the ground, often overshadowed by men's lack of understanding. Decision makers at the highest levels, such as ourselves, need to address this topic, need to move beyond words to actions, and beyond scattered initiatives to more systematic public policies that can properly sustain the necessary changes. This is the only way to ensure coherence and sustainability of results in the quest for equality. The Women, Peace and Security agenda and gender perspective should be placed as a core leadership element in the defense domain, not as something extra, not as an afterthought, but as something essential to further promote democratic values and human rights across the globe. To achieve and implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we must continue to collect data and to analyze information from a gender perspective. For gender disaggregated data, making it possible to analyze the potential impacts. Given the gender-differentiated human security impacts of the war, collection and inclusion of data related to these gender-based harms will allow to build on more complete situational awareness for decision makers at all levels. Portugal is committed to playing its part, and we know that we must lead by example. Gender equality and women, peace and security are streamlined as guiding principles in the policies of the Portuguese government, and defense is no exception. We are and we want to be at the forefront of these efforts. Thank you very much.
On behalf of Her Excellency, the Portuguese Minister of National Defense, Helena Carreiras, we thank you all for your presence and we declare this seminar closed. Thank you all.